What promises to be an informative lecture by Father Joseph McLaughlin from St. Michael's College. The title of this lecture is called The Limerick Lad and the Burlington Lady and the Founding of St. Michael's College. And Father Joe is a student of Irish history, formalizing his dissertation, finishing his PhD in 17th century Ireland, and he's working on that. The other thing, he's also former chairman of the Board of Trustees and Superior General of the Society of St. Edmund. And currently, Father Joe teaches in the Religious Studies Department at St. Michael's. The Burlington Irish Heritage Festival has had a wonderful week. We've had some tremendous events and wonderful attendance, which really shows the pride the Irish take in their heritage here in the Burlington area. A special thank you to RETN, who's filming today's lecture, which will be broadcast on cable television, as well as their support throughout the rest of the week. We have the winner of our raffle, a trip to Ireland, Jackie Collins. Jackie, there she is. So yes, there are winners from Ireland. Those of you who don't know the rest of the schedule tonight, there will be a lecture at St. Michael's College, 13 Irish authors seen through the eyes of etchings by an Irish-American artist named Jack Coughlin. That's tonight at St. Michael's College at 7:30. And then tomorrow there's a fun run, and tomorrow night the band Solace will be playing at the Flint Theater, and I believe there are still some tickets left. So without further ado, please let me introduce and give a warm welcome to Father Joe McLaughlin.
Thank you, Pat, for that very nice introduction, and thanks to the Burlington Irish Festival for arranging this event, and thanks to all of you for coming to the event. As you may tell, some of you know me, can tell, I have a cold, and as a result, my voice is either better or worse than it usually is. But I'll try to speak loudly enough so that you can at least hear what I'm saying, and to supplement the lack of my voice is at least some video, some slides that might be more entertaining than what you hear from me. In a few years hence, St. Michael's College will celebrate the 100th anniversary of its founding. Centennial anniversaries are a great catalyst for future planning and also a wonderful opportunity to look back into the past. The history of St. Michael's College is, I believe, a rich field and one that has been rarely furrowed. Like those few others who have studied the history of St. Michael's, I have found it to be full of surprises. Not the least of the surprises are the roles which a Limerick lad and a noble Burlington lady played in the creation of St. Michael's College. But before examining their roles, let me just briefly sketch the founding of the college itself. It would help if I put it on. I think it's this one. Okay. Let me just go back one here. On Monday, the 14th of September, 1904, St. Michael's College opened its doors to 35 boys and young men. The physical assets of the college consisted of one newly expanded building situated on 18 acres of land in that part of the town of Colchester known as Winooski Park. The building was a distinguished old farmhouse, as you can see in the front, to which had been hastily added a 4-story addition. The building stood on the corner of the road, now Route 15, which climbs up from Winooski Falls to the plateau of Winooski Park and then continues on into Essex Junction. Since the plateau falls off abruptly to the east of the college, the site affords spectacular easterly vistas of the Green Mountains, stretching across the horizon from Camel's Hump to Mount Mansfield. The core of the founding faculty of the college was composed of several French refugees, members of a Catholic religious order now known as the Edmundites or the Society of St. Edmund. It can be safely said that even 3 years prior to its opening, none of the founders of the college had the slightest idea they would ever be starting a college. In fact, most had only recently arrived in Vermont. What prompted the founding of St. Michael's was not a master plan, but rather a host of problems which some truly far-sighted and steadfast individuals turned into a high-risk opportunity. The problems were in France. In July 1901, the French government enacted the so-called Laws of Association, which were designed to force all male and female members of religious orders to submit to government control or else to depart from France and lose their properties. The laws were the climax of a decade-long contest between church and state in France, and a story far too complex for us today. The result, however, was that thousands of French sisters, priests, and brothers fled their native land, leaving behind their families and their labors. Most of the French refugees went to houses that their orders had established in other countries. Edmondites, unlike most others, had done little in anticipation of the chaos which erupted in July 1901. The only house which Edmondites at that time had outside of France was in Swanton, Vermont. Actually, Edmondites had first come to the New World in 1891, and the following year started a foundation at Keeler's Bay in South Hero. It was an inauspicious place for men from the Old World to encounter the New. Within 3 years, all the Edmondites had abandoned Keeler's Bay, most returning to France. One of them, however, remained in Vermont. He was a young Breton priest, Father Théophile Aubin, whose picture I would like to show, but I don't have it, who became truly the founder of the Edmondites in America. Perhaps because they shared a common Breton heritage, Father Aubin befriended Father Jean-Louis Calme, the founding pastor of Nativity Parish in Swanton. Father Calme had come to Vermont shortly after the Catholic Diocese of Burlington was created in 1853, and 5 years later, in 1858, Calme was sent by the first Bishop of Burlington, Louis de Gosbriand, another Breton, to found a parish in Swanton. 37 years later, in 1895, Calme initiated action to turn the administration of the large Swanton parish over to Father Aubin. In September 1895, Father Aubin became the pastor of Nativity Parish and the superior of a new house in Swanton, which consisted of himself and only one other Edmondite. Yet from this very weak beginning, Father Aubin quickly established at Swanton a solid foundation for the future growth of the Edmondites. In 1898, a school for aspiring Edmondites, both Vermonters and young Frenchmen, was opened in Swanton. It was Aubin who saw the growing church-state problems in France as an opportunity for expanding the Edmondite presence in Vermont. Most Edmondites, however, saw in the problems only the collapse of their works in France. The magnificent Mont Saint-Michel in Normandy, the ancient Cistercian Abbey in Pontigny in Burgundy, and several other institutions which Edmondites had rebuilt or newly established were confiscated by the French government and sold at auctions. People whose lives and careers had looked so promising in their homeland witnessed their heritage and their futures thrown into disarray. Yet Aubin viewed the disasters in France as a chance for a new beginning in Vermont. He himself went back to France in the summer of 1902 and saw for himself what one of his confreres described as, quote, the catastrophe, the destruction of all our works. Yet Aubin persuaded some of them, including even his despondent confrere, to leave with him for Vermont that September. Aubin also persuaded his Edmondite superiors to authorize the establishment of an Edmondite novitiate in Vermont. A novitiate is a specially designed house of training in which aspirants to a religious order live for a year so as to experience the order's way of life and to test their suitability for making professional religious vows. Establishing a novitiate is a formal and deliberate commitment, and it is to Aubin's great credit that amidst the catastrophe in France, he was able to obtain approval for planting a potential seed of rebirth in a place virtually unfamiliar to his religious superiors. Even before he returned to Swanton from France in September 1902, with 6 young and well-educated Edmondite aspirants, Aubin had concluded that it was desirable to establish a proposed novitiate away from Swanton. As important as the Swanton parish was for the Edmondites, it was still technically a work of the diocese and not a distinctly Edmondite work. So when Aubin went to France in the summer of 1902, he had begun to consider a possible site for a specifically Edmondite house in Vermont and had favored a location at Winooski Park. The proposed house, however, would not be only a novitiate, but also, he said, a college and an American headquarters for Edmondites. In other words, Aubin went back to France in July 1902 with some very ambitious plans. Evidently, Aubin's plans had crossed the paths of several others, most notably the new Bishop of Burlington, Jean Michaud, the founding pastor of St. Francis Xavier Parish in Winooski, Father Jean-Frédéric Odette, and Mother Émilie Renaud, the superior of the newly established Fanny Allen Hospital in Winooski Park. And since Father Calme, the founding pastor of the Nativity Parish in Swanton, was then chaplain at the Fanny Allen Hospital, he too may have played an important role in the decision. In any event, on Monday, the 29th of December, the Feast of St. Michael, only 8 days after returning from France, Aubin concluded negotiations to purchase what was then called the McLaughlin property in Winooski Park from Mr. and Mrs. Michael F. Kelly. The actual sale took place on Thursday, the 9th of October, the Kellys receiving $5,500 for the property. To translate money, I'm not going to bother, just add 2 zeros to any number that you get. So it's roughly equivalent to today's term of what the value is. So for $5,500, Father Oben acquired 18 acres of land, a farmhouse in which the Kellys had lived, and 3 small buildings. On Monday, the 13th of October, Oben formally opened the new St. Michael's house in Winooski Park, and 10 aspiring Edmondites, 8 Frenchmen, and 2 Americans began the novitiate. And I believe they're all pictured actually there, but you can't see them too well, but I've understood that they were there. Bob O'Brien may remember them being there, but Oben purchased the Kelly's property in his own name, but he had to borrow the full purchase price from the Swanton Bank, mortgaging both the new property and the Swanton property in the process. The high financial risks associated with the action reflected the greater overall risks associated with the whole venture. After all, Oben had only 3 other Edmondite priests working with him in Vermont. All were Frenchmen. One was in ill health, and Oben was the only American citizen. These 4, plus 2 brothers, had to provide not only for themselves, but for 2 seminarians preparing for ordination and the 10 novices. Yet despite all the risks, the acquisition of Kelly's majestic property was seen even by contemporaries to be a brilliant decision. 2 years later, in September 1904, after expanding the Kelly farmhouse, St. Michael's House became St. Michael's College. Among the many questions associated with the founding of St. Michael's, I'd like to explore one. Who were Michael and Ann Kelly? And how did these Irish-born Vermonters come to possess the magnificent property which they sold to Father Oben in 1902, and which became and is still the core of the property of St. Michael's College? Though both Michael Kelly and his wife, Anne, were buried in Burlington during the early part of the 20th century, their lives began across the Atlantic in Ireland. Michael was born in Limerick in 1835. Anne Quinn was born in County Cavan 4 years later in 1839. Unfortunately, at present, we don't know anything more about their families or the early lives of Michael and Anne. Michael left Ireland at the age of 12, which means that he was among the million Irish who fled the country during the Irish famine or the Great Hunger, the greatest tragedy in Irish history and one of the most tragic events in human history. Between 1845 and 1850, at least 1 million Irish people died in Ireland, and another million, including Michael Kelly, fled. Even today, a century and a half later, the population of the entire island is only 61% of what it was when Michael left. The particular circumstances in which Michael left, whether alone or with other family members, his means of travel, etc., are not presently known, nor is the place of his landing. I suspect, however, as I shall explain later, Michael ended up in New York City. The first record of Michael in the United States is as a soldier in the Union Army during the American Civil War. Michael was one of the 144,221 Irish-born soldiers who served in the Union Army during that remarkable and tragic war which had such a profound effect on the shaping of the American nation. It's amazing that so many Irishmen who had fled the horrors of the famine in Ireland found themselves in the battlefields of the war between the states. In Michael's case, he first appears as a non-commissioned officer in the 5th U.S. Light Artillery, Battery B, at the famous Battle of Cedar Creek during the Shenandoah Valley Campaign of 1864. Since Michael was a non-commissioned officer at this time, he must have entered the Union Army earlier. The 5th U.S. Light Artillery was under the command of Henry A. DuPont, the heir apparent of the E.I. DuPont de Nemours Company of Delaware, a firm which played a crucial role in manufacturing gunpowder for the Union Army during the Civil War. Henry DuPont went to the U.S. Military Academy, West Point, graduating at the top of his class in 1861, just as the war began. His first 2 years in the Army were spent in New York Harbor, where he was both first lieutenant of the 5th U.S. Artillery and assistant adjutant general of the Union troops in the harbor. Now, since regimental officers such as DuPont played a crucial role in recruiting their own soldiers, and since adjutant generals oversaw all recruitment, it seems likely that Michael Kelly was recruited while DuPont was in New York. In the summer of 1863, DuPont's Light Artillery Brigade was sent from New York to the battlefields of Virginia and joined the Department or Army of West Virginia. During the following summer and fall, DuPont's forces played a prominent role in the so-called Shenandoah Valley Campaign. According to Howard Coffin, the gifted writer of the history of Vermonters in the Civil War, quote, "No place in Vermont looks so much like the Shenandoah Valley as the Champlain Valley around the apple orchard towns of Addison and Shoreham. The mighty Adirondacks to one side, the lofty Green Mountains on the other, and down the middle runs Snake Mountain. Without Lake Champlain, the place is almost a twin of the Shenandoah Valley at the Cedar Creek North Fork confluence." The majestic beauty of the Shenandoah Valley also suggests its strategic importance. This lush strip of fertile river bottom land along Virginia's western border was the breadbasket of the South. The cornucopia between the Allegheny Mountains to the north and the Blue Ridge Mountains to the south provided abundant food for Robert E. Lee's Army of North Virginia. Additionally, the so-called Valley Turnpike running through the center of the valley was a virtual expressway northwards to the Potomac River and southwards to the town of Lexington, home of Virginia Military Academy, VMI, the West Point of the South. Indeed, it was one of VMI's most distinguished graduates, General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, who had successfully secured the Shenandoah Valley for the Confederates in 1862. 2 years later, however, with Lee's forces weakened, the Union government launched its offensive into the valley. A recounting of the Valley Campaign is beyond our purposes today, but a brief resume is needed to explain the importance of the culminating battle at Cedar Creek, at which Michael Kelly served with distinction. Captain DuPont's light artillery had their first major encounters in May and June of 1864 as part of the Union force of about 8,500 men, mostly infantry, some cavalry, fewer light and heavy artillery. DuPont's battery was usually composed of 6 3-inch guns, which were mounted on 2 wheels and thus capable of being quickly moved to support soldiers in the field. I think you can see in the picture there an example of the 3-inch gun right in the center that would be like the kind that he was associated with. Because of their great value and because they covered the foot soldiers, the light artillery were usually placed behind the combatants. During their first 3 engagements, the smaller Confederate forces won 2 out of 3 of the initial battles against the much larger Union Army. In these battles, DuPont and his men learned more than they wanted to about how to support a retreating army without letting either their guns or themselves fall into Confederate hands. After the 3rd battle, Union headquarters decided to change its overall strategy. A much larger army of about 37,000 men was mobilized and sent into the valley and placed under the overall command of a 33-year-old general, Philip Sheridan of Ohio, whose parents came from County Cavan. In the newly reorganized Army of the Shenandoah, under Sheridan's command, DuPont was made commander of the light artillery of Corps 8. Also forming part of Sheridan's force was the 1st Vermont Brigade, under the command of Colonel James Warner of Middlebury, which was attached to Corps 19. This was the first time DuPont's unit served alongside Vermonters. Under Sheridan, the Union forces won 2 major victories in September of 1864 at the battles of Opequon, or 3rd Winchester, and Fisher's Hill. DuPont's role in these victories earned him promotion to major. The Confederate force of about 21,000 men, led by General Jubilee O. Jube Early of Virginia, lost those 2 battles, but the men in gray were not actually defeated. However, Sheridan mistakenly thought O. Jube and his army had fled across the Blue Ridge Mountains. Based on that mistake, Sheridan made 2 further mistakes. He decided to withdraw his forces northward and to burn the crops and mills of the valley in order to make them useless to the Confederates. The burning, as it was called, began on the 29th of September and created a legacy of hatred among the residents of the Shenandoah Valley. The destruction also enraged Jube's army, motivating them in ways that Sheridan had not anticipated. Indeed, Sheridan didn't even think Early's army was still in the valley. But in the early morning hours of Wednesday, the 19th of October, Sheridan's army learned, to their great surprise, that the Confederates were very much in the valley. Thus began the Battle of Cedar Creek. General Early's scouts had spotted a strategic weakness in the deployment of Sheridan's army just south of Middleton. I know you probably can't make this up, but if you think of the red forces as the Confederates, the blues are the Federal forces, or the Union forces, and to the extreme left there you can see is DuPont's regiment. It's the best I can do to get some idea of what the battle is. However, Early's army numbered less than 21,000, whereas Sheridan had about 31,000. Early decided on a sudden attack before sunrise. Before 5 a.m., a large force of Confederates surged against the eastern flank of Corps 8, where DuPont's brigade was positioned. That's an extreme this side. Fortunately for himself and his men, DuPont was aware of the vulnerability of their position, and they quickly reacted to the Confederates' onslaught. Half of DuPont's guns fired point blank into the Confederates, while the other half retreated and repositioned themselves. This leapfrogging type of retreat, which they had learned in their earlier defeats, allowed DuPont to slow the Confederate advance and keep his guns from falling into Confederate hands. Meanwhile, the vast bulk of the Union Army had been caught in total surprise by the rebels' attack. As a result, most of the men in blue panicked and, quote, fled in their nightclothes without their guns, hats, or shoes, according to one witness. The broad plain was a scene of rout, wrote a Union officer. Wagons, ambulances, artillery, soldiers, every fellow for himself, moving backwards in sullen discouragement in the faces of the yelling victors. One of the few Union units to hold its ground was the 8th Vermont Regiment under the command of Colonel Stephen Thomas of Bethel. A sea of Confederate hands reached out for the banner of the 8th Vermont. 3 color bearers were killed, and men actually clenched and rolled upon the ground in desperate frenzy of the contest for the flag. Within a few minutes of hand-to-hand combat, the Vermont Regiment lost 110 of its 164 men. Early's army seemed on the verge of a tremendous victory. Meanwhile, General Sheridan was about 15 miles away from the battle at Winchester. The day before, he was in Washington trying to get support for his overall strategy. He left Washington on Tuesday evening, the 18th of October, taking a special train to Martinsburg, and then rode about 30 miles to Winchester, where he spent the night. He was awakened at 6 a.m. with reports of the boom of distant artillery. At first, he did not grasp the gravity of the situation. But 2 hours later, Sheridan perceived that things must be going very badly. He mounted his horse, the black gelding called Renzini, and rode south towards the fighting. At a distance, Sheridan later recalled, there burst upon our view the appalling spectacle of a panic-stricken army. Hundreds of slightly wounded men, throngs of others, unhurt but thoroughly demoralized, and baggage wagons by the score, all pressing to the rear in hopeless confusion. Sheridan's reaction to the rout of his army was truly brilliant. He broke from the company of the cavalrymen who were accompanying him and rode at a rapid clip into the face of his retreating forces. Thus began one of the most famous rides in military history. The effect of Sheridan's presence was remarkable. Even Sheridan marveled at how quickly the mood of the men changed from the depths of depression to the extreme of enthusiasm. Sheridan's ride, as it came to be known, literally changed the course of the Battle of Cedar Creek. By 4 p.m., Sheridan's army had been regrouped and went on the offense. By that evening, Early's Confederate army was soundly defeated. With a bit of legitimate hyperbole, Squire Howard of Jamaica and captain of the 8th Vermont Regiment wrote later, never since the world was created was such a crushing defeat turned into such a splendid victory as at Cedar Creek. The human price of victory and defeat at Cedar Creek was great. Confederate casualties were about 3,000. On the Union side, about 5,700, including more than 500 Vermonters. The impact of Cedar Creek on Vermonters is also attested to by the monumental painting of the battle that graces the State House in Montpelier, a work that was commissioned by the state legislature and executed by Julian Scott of Johnson, the first Vermonter awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. Militarily, the Battle of Cedar Creek meant that Shenandoah's breadbasket fell securely into Union hands, which was a tremendous loss to the Confederacy. Politically, Cedar Creek may well have saved Abraham Lincoln from defeat in the presidential election. News of the great Union comeback and of Sheridan's wonderful ride electrified the North. Abraham Lincoln suddenly had no need to worry about the re-election. With great pleasure, wrote Lincoln to Sheridan 3 days after Cedar Creek, I tender to you and your brave army the thanks of the nation and my own personal admiration and gratitude for the month's operation in the Shenandoah Valley, and especially for the splendid work on October the 19th. For his heroic conduct at Cedar Creek, Henry DuPont earned his promotion to lieutenant colonel and later the Congressional Medal of Honor. Before he received either of these justified rewards, DuPont wrote his own account of the battle in which he singled out the coolness and gallantry of his two lieutenants, one of whom was killed, the other captured. He also called attention to the zeal, courage, and splendid conduct of all the non-commissioned officers of the battery without exception. After all, the non-commissioned officers had to fill in for the lost lieutenants. Among the non-commissioned officers of Battery B, DuPont cited four by name, including, quote, Corporal of Ordnance Michael Kelly. As Corporal of Ordnance, Kelly had the unenviable responsibility of making sure that munitions were supplied to the guns and that these military assets were kept from Confederate hands during a strategic retreat. Since 245 rounds of ammunition were expended by DuPont's battery during the day and only one gun lost, DuPont's commendation of Kelly was surely well deserved. Many of those who fought at Cedar Creek were rewarded by being decommissioned, but that was not immediately the case for DuPont's brigade. DuPont himself even remained in the Army after the war, and Kelly may have stayed on a bit longer as well. DuPont and Kelly carried on a lifelong correspondence, even after DuPont became a U.S. Senator from Delaware in 1906. Kelly, however, next appears in public records in 1867, 2 years after the war, living and working in Burlington, Vermont. The circumstances that brought the 32-year-old Michael Kelly to Burlington have not yet been discovered. Could he have made friends with Vermonters at Cedar Creek? Could he have accompanied Sheridan when the general visited the Vermont State House in 1867 to commend publicly the gallant Vermonters he commanded at Cedar Creek? Or did Michael Kelly already have relatives in Burlington? At this point, we can only speculate. What we do know, however, about Michael's presence in the Queen City is equally curious. The Burlington City Directory simply reports, quote, Michael Kelly boards with T.R. Fletcher. With that brief entry begins a fascinating story of the Limerick lad's relationship with one of Burlington's most distinguished families. In 1867, Thaddeus R. Fletcher and his family lived on a four-acre plot on North Prospect Street across from Fern Hill. The Fletcher family had moved there in 1850, building the house which still stands at 179 North Prospect. Previously, the Fletchers had lived in the town of Essex in Jericho, Vermont. Thaddeus had operated a successful general store in Essex Junction, the profits from which he increased through a variety of real estate transactions which made him a very wealthy man. In 1828, Thaddeus married Mary Lawrence Peasley of Gilmantown, New Hampshire. She was 18 and he was about 10 years older when they married. Mary and Thaddeus had 5 children, but only 2 lived into adolescence. So when the Fletchers moved into their new Burlington home in 1850, they were accompanied by their 2 daughters, Mary Martha, age 20, and Ellen, age 16. In 1857, the Fletcher family suffered a tragic loss. Ellen died of consumption. The other daughter, Mary Martha, was similarly struck with consumption that year, and although she survived, she never fully recovered, remaining sickly for the rest of her life. 10 years later then, when Michael Kelly is first listed as boarding with them, the Fletchers were reduced to a family of 3, Thaddeus, age 67, his wife, Mary L., age 57, and their daughter, Mary M., age 37. Michael would have been 32. Michael Kelly was not simply a boarder with the Fletchers on North Prospect Street. He was also, in the words of a contemporary, the Fletchers' man of all work. The nature of Michael's specific responsibilities would seem to depend upon how the Fletchers themselves lived. By all accounts, they lived, quote, in singular privacy and seclusion. Mr. Fletcher caused the entire establishment to be run by one servant, the faithful Michael Kelly, who did the housework, the ironing, canning, took care of the garden, tended the cows, chickens, and horses, and served as a coachman in his spare time. This list of humble tasks that fell to Michael, if correct, does not accurately capture Michael's role as the one who ran the Fletcher establishment and endeared himself to the Fletcher family. In December 1871, Thaddeus Fletcher died, leaving a very large estate to his wife Mary. Michael Kelly was 36 at the time, and he continued living and working for the widow and the daughter. 2 years after the death of Thaddeus, Mrs. Fletcher and her daughter made a substantial donation of $24,000 to the city of Burlington to establish a library on condition that the city build and maintain a suitable building. The Fletcher's gift was very carefully structured, and it appears to have been the invention of the Fletcher's family physician, Dr. Walter Carpenter, who lived on Pearl Street, 233 Pearl Street, that's his house. Originally of Walpole, New Hampshire, and a Dartmouth graduate, Dr. Carpenter had moved to Burlington in 1853 and took a leading part in the establishment of the medical school connected with the University of Vermont. From the opening of the Fletcher Free Library in 1874 until his death in 1892, Dr. Carpenter was continuously a member of its board of directors. He was also one of the few people who actually knew the Fletcher ladies. Presumably, he attended Thaddeus when he died in 1871, and also Marielle when she died 6 years later in 1876. With the passing of her mother, Mary Martha, age 46, was the only Fletcher left living at their home on North Prospect Street. As if her mother's death was not shocking enough, Mary was diagnosed that year by a prominent Boston physician, Dr. Henry Ingerson Bodwich, to be suffering from, quote, a slow and lingering form of consumption, which having existed for 20 years, might hold out for as many more, though liable to a fatal termination at any time from untoward circumstances. Confronting her mortality, Mary did two important things in 1876. She made out her last will and testament, and she agreed to begin contributing huge sums of money to establish the first public hospital in Vermont, which was named in honor of her mother, the Mary Fletcher Hospital. Mary Martha's total contributions came to about $400,000. As her friend Matthew Buckham, the distinguished president of the University of Vermont, observed in 1886, Mary Martha's gifts to create the hospital constitute by far the largest benefaction made to the public in our state throughout its entire history. By all accounts, it was Dr. Carpenter, dean of UVM's medical school, who spearheaded the establishment of the hospital. In the words of a contemporary, quote, Carpenter was the instrument in securing the magnificent donation which founded the Mary Fletcher Hospital. Himself secured the charter, assisted in the preparation of the plans for the edifice, and since its completion has held the joint office of president and consulting physician of the institution. The state of Vermont chartered the hospital corporation on the 18th of November, 1876. Shortly afterwards, Moses Caitlin's 30-acre property on Colchester Avenue was acquired. The buildings then on Hospital Hill had to be removed or destroyed. Michael Kelly purchased 3 barns and the L of the Caitlin House for a total of $179. I believe Michael moved these buildings to Winooski Park, as they appear to have to be seen behind the house in the picture that we showed earlier in January in 1903. On Hospital Hill itself, construction moved ahead, and the hospital was completed in January 1879. About $30,000 was spent on acquiring the property and constructing the hospital. An additional $50,000 was spent furnishing and equipping the hospital. The rest of Mary Martha's gifts were for endowments to offset operating expenses or to provide free beds for the needy. Apparently, Mary Martha only saw the hospital she had made possible once in her lifetime, and that was on Tuesday, the 24th of February, 1885, the day she died. In the words of President Buckham, the closing scene of Miss Fletcher's life was especially touching. Fortunately, the story was recounted by both Buckham and Dr. Carpenter. Carpenter's account was later put into writing by his neighbor, John Stearns. I'll use his account. Miss Fletcher's health had been failing for a considerable time, and on the day of her death, Dr. Carpenter, who was then 76 years of age, called to see her at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. He saw at once that she was in a dying condition. She apparently sensed the situation from the doctor's appearance and manner and said to him, "Doctor, am I very near the end?" He replied, "Yes." She said, "Will I live until night?" And the doctor answered, "I'm afraid not." She then said, "I want to die in the hospital." Dr. Carpenter felt that it was impossible to get her there. It was a cold day and snowing hard, and the doctor had only his one-seated sleigh. It appeared out of the question to procure an ambulance, and he told her he did not consider it possible to get her to the hospital. Miss Fletcher, however, was a woman of iron will, and she said, "Doctor, you must take me to the hospital at once. I am determined not to die until I get there. The doctor saw it was useless to oppose her, so he called her man of all works, Michael Kelly. They carefully wrapped her up in blankets, and Kelly carried her in his arms from the bed to the sleigh, which fortunately was covered. When Kelly and Miss Fletcher were in, there was no room on the seat for the doctor, so he knelt on the running board and drove his faithful old horse, Whiteface, as fast as they could through the driving snow to the hospital. He said, "I was in mortal terror for fear she would die before we got there." However, they reached the hospital in safety. One can visualize the frail body of Mary Martha wrapped in blankets and being held in the arms of the Limerick lad, both inside the sleigh as they sped down North Prospect Street, driven by Dr. Carpenter, who was somehow able to keep himself on the running board. President Buckham continues the story at the hospital. Taken up from her bed in the arms of her faithful attendant, Michael Kelly, she was conveyed in a sleigh to the hospital and laid upon the bed in her own room, where nobody but herself had ever rested. And there, murmuring thanks, she was permitted to be where she was. In a brief space, she breathed her life gently away. Attended by the president, the superintendent, members of the staff, and nurses of the hospital she had founded. It was all exactly as she might have wished, and doubtless did wish, during those many days of weakness and pain, through and beyond which she has now forever passed. Mary Fletcher's funeral was held at the hospital on Friday afternoon. The Free Press described it as a funeral that will long remain as a deeply impressive one in the minds of all who were present. Vermont's Adjutant General, T.S. Peck, was in charge of arrangements. A great number of citizens gathered, including many notable Burlingtonians. For example, among Mary Martha's pallbearers were her physician, Dr. Carpenter, the mayor, George Morse, Judge Torrey Wales, S.M. Pope, Henry Loomis, Dr. A.J. Willard. The service was conducted by the Reverend L.G. Ware of the Church Street Unitarian Church. A fine eulogy was given by President Buckham. Since Mary had never married and died childless, the task of greeting those who came to pay their respects fell to her father's relatives from Middlebury and to Judge Allen, and, according to the Free Press, to, quote, Mr. Kelly. The only person with an Irish name mentioned in the extensive press report was Michael Kelly. After the service, Mary Fletcher's casket was carried to the hearse, and a line of sleighs which extended from the hospital grounds to Greenmount Cemetery followed the remains to the grave. There, the Burlington lady was interred, with all the members of her family at a site overlooking the Winooski River. It's not too clear a picture now. How was it then that the 50-year-old Limerick lad participated so prominently at the funeral of Burlington's most renowned yet most reclusive lady? We may never know the full answer to that intriguing question, but we do have some fascinating clues. I mentioned earlier that in 1876, after the death of her mother and the medical confirmation of her own serious illness, Mary Fletcher did two things. She began her extremely generous benevolence, which established the hospital, and she made out her last will and testament. By any standards, especially for an extremely wealthy woman, Mary Fletcher's will is extraordinarily simple, yet she never changed it. There are only 3 specific bequests. She gave $500 to Greenmount Cemetery for perpetual care of the Fletcher lot. She willed her house on Prospect Street with all its furnishings to her maternal uncle, George L. Peasley of Auburn, Maine. And then, to quote directly, "I give to Michael Kelly, my faithful servant, $10,000 forever." Those were all of Mary Fletcher's specific bequests. The residue of her substantial estate she gave to the Mary Fletcher Hospital, a corporation lately chartered by the legislature of the state of Vermont, she said. So in 1876, at which time Michael Kelly had lived and worked with the Fletcher family for only 9 years, Mary Fletcher willed to him a very sizable legacy. Moreover, Michael Kelly is the only person mentioned in her entire will with any emotive description. He was, she wrote, my faithful servant. Thus, Michael had earned Mary's respect and affection long before he carried her in his arms in that driving snowstorm 9 years later, so that she could die within the hospital she had helped to create. In his eulogy for Mary Fletcher, President Buckham recalled poignant words that Mary had spoken to him. "I wish," she said, "to be remembered hereafter simply as one who had an obligation and tried to fulfill it, as one who had a work to do and tried to do it, as well as a poor sick woman could." Curiously, Mary Fletcher's own self-description was that of a faithful servant. Thus, her description of Michael Kelly as my faithful servant is quite revealing. It has been suggested that Michael must have been something of a brother to Mary Fletcher. Indeed, he well might have been. On the 27th of May, 1885, Michael Kelly received his $10,000 legacy. Since 6 months later, Michael married Anne Quinn, their marriage being celebrated in the old Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception with the founding bishop of the Diocese of Burlington, Louis de Gosbriand, officiating. This is one of the few recorded mentions of Anne Quinn. Her only appearance in the Burlington city directories was in 1877, where she was described as a seamstress who boards with Edward Dwyer. Edward Dwyer was a liveryman who lived above his stables located at the corner of Bank and Center Streets. He must have been either a relative or a very close friend of Anne Quinn. It is possible that Anne Quinn is also the Anna O'Connor who was listed in the 1870 federal census as being a domestic living with the Fletchers on North Prospect Street. Anne clearly must have had some intimate acquaintance with Mary Fletcher, since a house and lot on Prospect Street was deeded to Anne on 19th of May, 1882, before Mary Martha died, a transaction seemingly made possible by Mary Fletcher. And the executors of Mary Fletcher's estate allowed payments to only a few creditors, including a small amount to an Anne Quinn. Additionally, shortly after Mary Fletcher's death, but before his marriage to Anne, Michael Kelly purchased the Fletcher home and the 4 acres of land on North Prospect Street. It seems likely, therefore, that Anne lived at the former Fletcher home when she married Michael Kelly. The marriage registry reports that when Anne Quinn was of Burlington on their wedding day, Michael was of Colchester. 5 years earlier, on the 12th of February, 1881, while Mary Fletcher was alive, Michael acquired the 100-acre Penniman Farm in Winooski Park from Edward Hungerford. You may be able to see that, not too clearly, I can see. That'll be the property at the corner and then across the street. It didn't come out too well on that. How Michael managed to acquire the Penniman Farm, a substantial property, is not yet clear to me. I suspect, however, that Mary Fletcher's generous future bequest to her faithful servant played some part. Insofar as Mary deeded some of her North Prospect Street property to Anne Quinn in May, it seems only likely that she would have facilitated Michael's acquisition of the Winooski Park property, to which he had moved 4 buildings from the Hospital Hill, which he had purchased in 1877. After their marriage, Michael and Anne Kelly settled in the former Babcock House on that part of the Penniman Farm, then called the McLaughlin property. Michael was 51, Anne was 47. 7 years later, the Kellys were involved in 2 major and seemingly interrelated land transactions in Winooski Park. First, in February 1892, they purchased the so-called Dunbar Hotel and its 60 acres of land, which adjoined their Penniman property just to the north. The Kellys then owned about 200 acres of land in Winooski Park, had 55 milking cows, a good-sized farm which required 3 men to run in the winter and 5 in the summer. The farm's annual income was about $3,260 a year. Why then did, it's not clear what prompted Michael to make his offer of some of his farm to the, about that time that he had acquired this new land, he also decided to present himself to the new coadjutor bishop of Burlington, Bishop John Michaud, and offered the bishop some of his property in order to create a Catholic hospital. It's not clear what prompted Michael's offer. There is a legend that on her deathbed, Mary Fletcher confided to Michael that if she were to build another hospital in Burlington, she would place Catholic sisters in charge of it. The legend seems far-fetched. But it could be that Michael and Anne, having no children, were influenced by the memory of their former mistress, who was also childless. According to Bishop Michaud, who consulted widely before accepting the Kellys' offer, Bishop de Gosbriand desired for many years to see a sisters' hospital in Burlington or the area. And this Bishop de Gosbriand might well have suggested the proposal to the Kellys. In any event, on the 22nd of March, 1894, the Kellys deeded the Dunbar Hotel and about 25 acres of land to Bishop Michaud, receiving in return assurance of suitable and convenient rooms, board, fire, and light in the hospital building whenever they wish, free of cost or expense to them, so long as they live. On Thursday, the 24th of May, 1894, about 5 months later, a community of religious hospitalers of St. Joseph arrived from Montreal at Essex Junction, where they were welcomed by the pastor of St. Stephen's Church in Winooski. Father Whitaker conveyed the sisters in his horse-drawn carriage to the Dunbar Hotel, where they began almost immediately to transform it into the Fanny Allen Hospital, named after the first Vermonter to enter their order, Frances Margaret Allen, the daughter of Ethan Allen. 8 years later, as we have seen, Michael and Ann Kelly sold their home and 18 acres of land to Father Oben. It appears that Michael and Ann continued to live at the new St. Michael's house for 2 more years after they sold the property. But in 1904, they took up their residence in the Fanny Allen Hospital, as had been provided for under their gift. This is a picture of their room. Their move may well have been prompted by all the construction which took place that year to put the first addition onto their former home so that it could become the new St. Michael's College. Michael and Ann were then 69 and 65, respectively. They lived together in their humble quarters at the hospital for the next 3 years. On Sunday, the 14th of April, 1907, Ann Quinn Kelly died at the hospital. The funeral mass for the 69-year-old Cavan woman was celebrated by the founding president of St. Michael's College, Father Armand Prevel, in the Fanny Allen Hospital Chapel. The summer after Ann's death saw the building of the northern end of Founders Hall, the building then closely resembling what we now see, except that the Kelly's house at the southern end still remained as it was when they lived in it. I don't know if you can see at the very end, the house is still the 2-story farmhouse. It had not been added on to, and you had a different kind of tower at the top of it. But that was the house, that was what St. Michael's looked like in 1907. Michael himself passed from this life 3 years later, on the Feast of the Assumption, the 15th of August, 1912, a few months after the sinking of the Titanic. The Free Press accounts of his death drew attention to Michael's benefactions. Quote, "During the last 8 years of his life, which he spent at the hospital, he endeared himself to the inmates, who looked upon him not only as a benefactor, but as a founder as well. In the establishing of the institution, Mr. Kelly has done a great deal to relieve suffering humanity, and the world at large must feel him a benefactor. He was also instrumental in the establishment of St. Michael's College at Winooski." End of quote. Michael was indeed instrumental in the establishment of St. Michael's. By the time of Michael's death in 1912, the college enrolled more than 100 students, and the Kelly's old farmhouse had been added to become most of what is now Founders Hall. And going back to 1902, when Michael and Ann sold their home to Father Oben, official Edmondite records indicate that the name chosen for the new house was partly in honor of the Limerick lad. Quote, "Definitive arrangements having been concluded on September the 29th, the feast of St. Michael the Archangel. The name of the former proprietor, a virtuous man, being Michael. Reasons of a superior order and all our attachments of the past binding us to the great Archangel, the name of St. Michael's House was given to this new foundation." Michael's funeral mass was celebrated in the hospital chapel by 3 French Edmondites, some of whom would be known by people here, I'm sure, Fathers Eugene Alliot, Jean Herouet, and Marcel Goutin, with the new Bishop of Burlington, Joseph Rice, and 2 prominent Burlington priests in the sanctuary. Also attending were religious hospitalers, doctors, and the staff of the Fanny Allen Hospital, and a sizable delegation from the Grand Army of the Republic, Standard Post 2 of Burlington, led by their commander, George Martin. Michael's former comrades in arms placed the old flag he served and loved so well upon his body. Michael had been a long-time member of the Standard Post, which was organized in 1868, and which often held its weekly meetings in this very building, the Fletcher Library. Just as Michael had probably been the only Irish Catholic who participated at the funeral of the Burlington lady, it's a tribute to Michael's ecumenism that his Civil War veterans, Yankee Protestants, participated at his funeral, celebrated in Latin by French refugees. Michael's remains were carried to St. Joseph's Cemetery in Burlington, where they were interred beside his wife, Anne. And they were then just down the street from where both of them had lived and worked with Mary Fletcher. So, 78 years after being born in Limerick, and 66 years after fleeing the great Irish famine to America, 50 years after his heroic service at Cedar Creek, and about 44 years after coming to Vermont, Michael Kelly's life on this side came to its end. Though he and his wife had no children, tens of thousands of men and women have benefited from the Kellys' enduring legacies, the Fanny Allen Hospital and St. Michael's College. And when St. Michael's celebrates its centenary in 2004, I hope someone standing that day on the Kelly farm will raise a glass to the memory of the Limerick lad and his wife and to the Burlington lady whom they had befriended. Thank you.